Hello everyone, welcome to the Lightning Ball channel. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. Your support fuels my continued efforts. In our previous episode, Rimuru and Guy gathered with everyone in the destroyed castle's conference room to exchange opinions, share information, and reassess future strategies. During this, Rain, who had been punished to kneel for holding a girls' party during the battle, unexpectedly became the greatest contributor by obtaining crucial enemy intelligence and revealing the secret of the Lord of Justice's control. In this episode, we will continue the content of this meeting, mainly focusing on the analysis results of the enemy major forces, Velzard, Zalario, Feldway, and Jahil. Let's get started. After Rain and Diablo's farce ended, the group resumed their discussion of the current situation. First was Frost Dragon Velzard. Although Guy was still grumbling about Rimuru not coming to help him, he reluctantly admitted that Velzard hadn't lost her sanity, and that Michael's increased control over his subordinates didn't seem to affect her. Velzard was merely venting her long-held grievances against Guy. Guy explained that he had wanted to minimize Velzard's destruction of Golden City by dragging her into a different dimension for their fight, but he couldn't manage to control her. This was expected, given that Velzard was the oldest existing true dragon. This situation indeed sounded very much like a marital quarrel, just as Rimuru initially thought, and staying out of it was certainly the wise choice. The second topic of discussion was Zalario, who had fought against Diablo. Surprisingly, Diablo gave Zalario very high praise. Diablo stated that Zalario was an incredibly powerful opponent, and in his view, possibly even stronger than Feldway. Diablo explained that while Feldway could be agitated by his annoying psychological tactics, Zalario remained unfazed. Zalario possessed a calm warrior demeanor, making Diablo's psychological strategies ineffective, necessitating a battle of sheer strength to determine the winner. Guy agreed with Diablo's assessment. He remarked that Zalario was vastly different from Cornu, who had been killed by Velgrind. From the beginning, Zalario was exceptionally strong. Even in ancient battles against the evil god Ivaraj, Zalario had proven to be highly effective. Calm and powerful, that's the impression Zalario left on others. If Cornu was the type to flee as soon as defeat seemed imminent, Zalario was the kind who would fight to the end, no matter how dire the situation. Such individuals are formidable opponents in any world. Diablo then pointed out that midway through their battle, Zalario's movements became monotonous, suggesting that Feldway might have done something. Diablo, being experienced in combat, grew suspicious and kept a vigilant eye on the situation. He concluded that Zalario's change wasn't a trap but rather an actual anomaly. At this point, Kigali mentioned that she initially retained her self-awareness and tried to escape, but lost it completely when Feldway appeared. Moreover, there was something very strange. If Feldway had joined the action earlier, he could have secured victory before Rimuru arrived. However, Feldway peculiarly chose to observe the battle instead of participating. If he had no intention of intervening, there was no reason for him to go to Kigali's location. This led everyone to speculate that Feldway must have had another objective. After a moment, both Rimuru and Guy arrived at the answer. However, Diablo was the first to speak up, concluding that Feldway could also use the power of Lord of Justice, specifically the Ultimate Dominion. This was further validated by Feldway's control over Leon. The question was to what extent Feldway could use this power, whether he had accepted Michael's authority or was acting as Michael's eyes. Just like Rimuru's surveillance magic, the Eye of God, which could activate Megiddo from afar, Feldway might allow Michael to exert control through his vision. However, Guy disagreed with this view, providing two reasons. First, the conditions for such control through someone else's vision would be too stringent. Second, if Feldway were merely acting as Michael's eyes, then others could do the same. Michael would likely prepare multiple individuals for this purpose, making Feldway's presence unnecessary. Seal then revealed the truth. Seal posited that since Michael had absorbed Velgrind's dragon factor, he could use parallel existence. Thus, it was possible for Michael to copy the Lord of Justice's power and give it to Feldway. This not only explained the control issue but also addressed the mystery of why Rimuru's meticulously practiced swordsmanship, imaginary blade, was nullified. Feldway could use the all-defending castle guard. Rimuru suddenly realized that Feldway hadn't even needed to defend against his attacks. Using his sword to block was merely a facade. This thought brought Rimuru some relief. If he had used a stronger sword technique in the heat of the moment, it would have been nullified as well, exposing his most powerful skill. Following Seal's explanation, Rimuru shared this insight with everyone and proposed another theory. He suggested that the Dominion power didn't affect everyone simultaneously. There was a noticeable time gap between Zalario being controlled and Kigali and Leon falling under control. Additionally, Pico and Gracia, who were in Rain's ice hut, didn't experience further enhanced control. Summarizing this, Rimuru proposed that to activate the Dominion through the Lord of Justice, direct recognition of the target was necessary. However, another problem arose. If they couldn't break through the castle guard, there was no way to defeat Feldway. Additionally, Feldway not only possessed the ultimate dominion, which could control all angelic ultimate skills, but also had Regalia Dominion, a skill capable of dominating non-angelic skills. Although Regalia's control was not as absolute as ultimate dominion, it was still overwhelming for those whose soul strength had not reached the ultimate level. This significantly limited the number of people who could challenge Feldway. Despite this, Rimuru remained optimistic. Knowing that Feldway relied on Castle Guard actually reassured him. The reason is simple. The power source of Castle Guard is the loyalty of subordinates and citizens. Rudra's Castle Guard was invincible because it was supported by the loyalty of countless imperial citizens. Feldway, on the other hand, draws power from the loyalty of the Phantom race. Rimuru couldn't bring himself to ruthlessly slaughter innocent Empire's citizens, but the Phantom race would be invaders, seemingly intent on destroying the entire central world. Rimuru would resist them with full force, without hesitation or guilt. The last topic of discussion was Jahil. Honestly, Rimuru had no idea who this Jahil really was. Benimaru, who was typically very proud and competitive, had unusually praised his opponent this time. Benimaru admitted that although he had grown much stronger, his opponent Jahil was extremely formidable. They were only able to reach a stalemate because they both specialized in similar skills and magic attributes. However, Benimaru stubbornly insisted that if the battle had continued, even though the chances were slim, he might have won. Rimuru looked at Benimaru with a sense of exasperation. Jahil's existence points were 4 times higher than Benimaru's, making it nearly impossible for Benimaru to bridge such a vast energy gap with skill alone. Moreover, in Rimuru's view, Benimaru had already undergone extensive training, and it was unlikely he would see dramatic growth in a short period. However, Rimuru had always had some trouble accurately gauging his subordinates' strengths, as it was Seal who had been aiding their growth. At this moment, Seal was utterly speechless at Rimuru. The slow-witted Rimuru, despite inwardly praising Benimaru for his indomitable spirit, still decided to remind Benimaru to avoid reckless and impulsive actions. Guy, on the other hand, seemed to greatly admire Benimaru, his face full of approval and encouragement. Then, as if remembering something, Guy suddenly asked Rain and Misery about the name of the fool who had originally summoned him to this world. Misery replied that it was a high human who called himself the Super Sorcerer Emperor, also named Jahil. Rain added that this was the first high human created by the stupid Twilight Valentine. Realizing her slip of the tongue, Rain quickly corrected herself, stating that even Twilight Valentine thought Jahil was mentally unstable and considered him a failed experiment. The Emperor who had summoned Guy tens of thousands of years ago, only to be killed, releasing the demon into the world and becoming infamous in various magical and historical records, was also named Jahil. It was hard to believe this was a mere coincidence. However, at that moment, Kigali asserted that this Jahil was undoubtedly her father. Kigali had a reason to raise this objection. The primary point was that Kigali's father was a high elf, while the Jahil mentioned by Guy and the others was a high human. Kigali's father, once known as a benevolent ruler of the high elves, had suddenly declared himself the Super Sorcerer Emperor one day, beginning a tyrannical reign and even killing Milim's pet dragon. Afterward, Feldway had preserved Jahil, who had been killed by the rampaging Milim, and placed his spirit within Footman. Kigali further explained that her conversations with Jahil had confirmed that he was indeed her father. Yet, Sylvia raised an objection. She stated that this Jahil was indeed created by Twilight Valentine as the ancestor of the entire human race. Since Sylvia herself was also created by Twilight Valentine as the ancestor of the High Elves, she had unique insight. Additionally, the ancestors of the vampires, such as Luminous, and the ancestors of the High Dwarves, like Gurin Dwargo, were also species created by Twilight Valentine. Given that this information came from Guy and Sylvia, who were akin to living relics of history, Rimuru had no reason to doubt its accuracy. Kigali, through this series of conversations, realized the discrepancy in her understanding and began to ponder the cause. She quickly arrived at the conclusion that her father's body had been taken over by Jahil. Jahil was a despicable person, and it was possible that he had used some method that prevented Rain and Misery from completely killing him in the past, which subsequently brought trouble to Kigali. The cause and effect of these events were thus linked together, and everyone agreed on the true nature of Jahil. Upon learning the truth, Kigali was choked with emotion and slumped helplessly into her chair. Seeing her in this state, Rimuru and the others didn't know what to say and quietly left the meeting room. That night, the group gathered in a different location, sharing drinks with each other. Although Guy had forgiven Rain, he kept complaining about Rimuru's precious experimental alcohol. Under pressure, Rimuru reluctantly took out some alcohol from his stomach storage to share with everyone, continuing to ponder future strategies. The main topic was what to do with Golden City El Dorado, now that Leon was absent. Although the damage was not extensive, many people had been displaced. If the phantoms or insectoids invaded, the city could be easily overrun due to the lack of defensive power. Additionally, with about 20 million residents in Golden City, relocating them to other countries was unrealistic. Even though Leon's absence made it unlikely that the city would be targeted, Rimuru felt that doing nothing was not an option. Some form of action was necessary. Rimuru tentatively suggested that Guy probably wouldn't want to stay here. To Rimuru's surprise, Guy readily agreed to the proposal. Guy stated that although the place currently held little strategic importance, it was possible that some brainless enemies might target it indiscriminately. Thus, protecting the residents here wasn't out of the question for him. Guy agreed so readily that Rimuru found himself at a loss for how to respond. Sylvia, surprised, remarked that the fearsome, cold, and ruthless primordial red turned out to be such a reasonable demon, which was vastly different from the rumors. Please note, this was actually the first time Sylvia met with Guy. Hearing such praise made Guy uncomfortable, and he asked if Rimuru and Sylvia were trying to pick a fight with him. Rimuru immediately replied that he couldn't possibly take on Guy and wouldn't dare provoke him. Sylvia, half-jokingly, said she had always admired the reliable Mr. Guy Crimson. Both of them quickly covered their awkwardness with forced smiles. Thus, the handling of Golden City was decided. During the talk, Kigali, having calmed down, entered the room. After the sadness, only emptiness remained. She sat down near Guy. Guy, ever direct, asked Kigali if there was something she wanted to say. His straightforwardness had always been part of his charm. Knowing Guy's personality well, Kigali smiled wryly and said she wanted to talk about some distant stories that only she knew. Kigali, seemingly unburdened, began to share her story. Rimuru sensed that this conversation was far from over, so they all sat silently, listening to Kigali's tale. She spoke of her origins as a princess of a great nation, her long life, the guilt she felt towards Milim, the fear she had of Guy, and the jealousy she harbored towards Leon, all of which gradually transformed and elevated her. As Rimuru listened, he began to feel a bit guilty about having killed Clayman. Kigali's words revealed the bonds between her and her companions, and in her story, Clayman emerged as a gentle and caring man. However, after becoming a demon lord, Clayman's heart turned proud. This change led him to be manipulated by Tatsuya Kandu, becoming the source of many evil deeds, ultimately abandoned by the demon lords and killed by Rimuru. Rimuru wanted to explain more about Clayman, but Kigali stopped him. She acknowledged that it was the fate she and Clayman brought upon themselves. She said that making decisions had always been her responsibility, and the circumstances arose because Rimuru was simply smarter. In this world of the survival of the fittest, there was no need to sympathize with the losers. The Clayman that Rimuru saw had already become the embodiment of evil, and if not eliminated, would have caused even greater harm. It was an unavoidable situation. However, no one had expected Clayman to be manipulated. Perhaps feeling a sense of sympathy, Rimuru decided to share with Kigali something he had been contemplating, information about Clayman and Tia. During the battle, Tia suffered severe injuries while protecting Kigali. Although Tia had caused Rimuru and his allies quite a bit of trouble in the past, they were now allies. As Tia recuperated in the medical room, Rimuru decided to help her, and received a response from Seal. Seal informed Rimuru that the infant that composed Clayman's core had been isolated and preserved after Clayman was devoured by Rimuru. Seal asked if these infants should be used to repair the parts of Tia's core damaged by the ultimate level skill. Rimuru agreed with Seal's proposal. When Rimuru devoured Clayman, he thought that all of Clayman had been converted into energy, but it turned out that some remnants had been preserved. Rimuru didn't want these remnants of Clayman to remain inside him. He believed that Clayman would be happier returning to his companions rather than remaining as a part of Rimuru. Of course, if Seal, with her omnipotence, had the infants, she could fully resurrect Clayman using a pseudo-soul. However, Rimuru didn't suggest this option. Clayman was already dead, and Rimuru wanted him to become a part of Tia, helping her to survive. Rimuru had been hesitant to tell Kigali about his action, which he had made out of personal sentiment, but now he felt it was time to share it with her. Upon hearing Rimuru's explanation, Kigali expressed her gratitude on behalf of Tia. For Kigali, the safety of her companions was paramount. She hadn't expected that it was the deceased Clayman who had saved the dying Tia, and her smile carried a tinge of pain. Rimuru nodded, intending to conclude the matter. However, Rimuru had momentarily forgotten that Guy and Sylvia were also present. Guy questioned Rimuru's seemingly capricious actions, while Sylvia remarked that even the notoriously eccentric Twilight Valentine had never done something as radical as collecting remnants of the dead and transplanting them into another's core. Both wore expressions of astonishment. Outspoken as always, Sylvia remarked that Rimuru was indeed unusual, even more so than what she'd heard from her daughter Elmesia. Guy inquired how Rimuru had managed Clayman's remnants, revealing his perennial curiosity about other skills. Rimuru resorted to his usual tactic of feigning ignorance, claiming it was all a coincidence and offering vague explanations. The book didn't detail how Rimuru evaded Guy's questions, but he felt a bit of sorrow at his habitual need for evasiveness. Revealing his skills was out of the question. Sylvia remained skeptical, suggesting that Rimuru was concealing something. Guy, growing impatient, demanded Rimuru to be more forthcoming, accusing him of saying things that were largely irrelevant. Rimuru, feeling exasperated, admitted to himself that he was also puzzled by many things. In reality, it was Seal who orchestrated these actions. Rimuru didn't fully understand the principles behind them, so being asked about it left him genuinely troubled. Despite this, the group continued their enjoyable and intimate conversation late into the night. Sylvia asked about her husband, the former hero Sarian, now known as Laplace. Kigali happily reminisced about the past, recounting Sarian's brave defeat of the Chaos Dragon, his memory loss, becoming a member of the moderate Harlequin Alliance, and his enduring character as Laplace. Rimuru was hearing for the first time that Laplace was Elmesia's father, which left him utterly astonished. Kigali mentioned that while it might upset Sylvia, she felt fortunate to have met Laplace. Sylvia responded that hearing Kigali's stories about Laplace made her happy too, indicating that even after death, his character hadn't changed. She added that Laplace's decision to risk his life to protect his companions, despite having the chance to escape, showed his immense pride in being a part of the moderate Harlequin Alliance. At this point, Rimuru interjected, suggesting that Laplace and Yuki might still be alive. Even Seal had indicated that the possibility of their survival wasn't zero, so Rimuru also believed they might not be dead. Rimuru didn't even feel sadness, perhaps because he had been deceived by Yuki so many times that he subconsciously thought Yuki was deceiving him again. Rimuru's words unexpectedly lifted the spirits of Kigali and Sylvia. Kigali remarked that Yuki had always been a resilient person. Sylvia, on the other hand, lamented that Sarian, now a death man, had completely forgotten about her, concluding that such a useless man wasn't worth keeping. The deep night conversation continued, as everyone strived to overcome today's sorrows for the sake of tomorrow's victory in battle. Alright, that's all for this video. In fact, although Diablo found Zalario more challenging to deal with than Feldway, this doesn't mean Feldway is weaker than Zalario. Diablo actually believes Feldway's true strength rivals that of the true dragons, and may even surpass Guy. We'll explore these insights further in the next episode through a private conversation between Diablo and Rimuru. Additionally, we'll focus on the movements of Michael and Feldway. The next episode promises to be just as exciting. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is greatly appreciated. See you in the next one.